The wind had a way of speaking on the plains, and tonight it spoke of dust and distance. It was a low, mournful sound that carried the grit of 1,000 miles, pulling it across the parched earth in a fine, brown sheet that settled on everything like a shroud. Jedediah felt it on his teeth, in the dry corners of his eyes. His horse, a sturdy roan named Dust Devil, felt it too, dropping its head with a weary sigh, its breath pluming white in the cooling twilight air. For hours, there had been nothing but the endless sea of grass, the bruised purple of the horizon, and the slow, rhythmic creak of saddle leather. Then, he saw it, a smudge against the darkening sky that slowly resolved into a shape, a cabin. It stood alone, a testament to stubbornness, built of rough-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast emptiness. It was the place he'd been riding toward, the place that had pulled him across 2 territories. He reined Dust Devil to a walk, his eyes scanning the ground. The light was failing, sinking below the world's edge, but he could still make out the faint traces of old hoof prints near a water trough, blurred by wind and time. The mud around them was cracked and dry. No one had come or gone in a while. The cabin itself was small, more a shack than a home, with a single window that now began to glow with the soft, flickering light of an oil lamp. It was a lonely light in a lonely land. Jedediah swung down from the saddle, his joints groaning in protest. His boots, heavy with dust, landed with a soft thud on the packed earth. The ride had been long, and the weariness went clear through to his bones. He stood for a moment, letting the blood return to his legs, his hand resting on the warm, familiar flank of his horse. Dust Devil nudged his shoulder, a silent question. Jedediah gave the horse's neck a reassuring pat before reaching to uncinch the saddle. The sound of the leather strap pulling through the metal buckle was sharp and clear in the quiet air, a small, mechanical noise in the vast, organic whisper of the wind. He didn't lead the horse to the trough. Not yet. He simply stood, holding the reins loosely in his calloused hand, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. He was a man accustomed to waiting, to reading the signs in the land and in the silence. And now, the silence was full of them. It was thick with the years that had passed, with words left unsaid and deeds that could not be undone. He could feel the weight of it settling over him, heavier than his dusty coat. The wooden door creaked open. A figure emerged, stepping onto the small, warped porch. It was her, Abigail. The lamplight from inside spilled out around her, creating a halo that softened her edges but couldn't hide the straightness of her spine or the set of her jaw. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back from her face in a practical knot. She wore a simple dress, partly covered by a man's worn canvas coat that looked too big for her shoulders. The fabric was stained with dust and work. She wasn't the girl he remembered, but she was unmistakably the woman she had become. She held a rifle in the crook of one arm. Its barrel pointed toward the ground, but held with an ease that said it was no stranger to her hands. Her face was in shadow, but he didn't need to see it to know the expression it held. He had seen it in his mind 1,000 times on the long ride here, wary, guarded, unflinching. They stood there, separated by 20 yards of dying light and a history that felt as wide and desolate as the plains themselves. The wind tugged at a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her face. She didn't brush it away. He saw the slight rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath. He knew she was watching his hands, his posture, judging his intent. They knew each other, had known each other in a time before the world had broken them into these harder shapes. But the thing that lay between them, the event that had sent them on their separate, winding paths, had never been given a name. It was a ghost that had followed them both, a silence that was louder than any accusation. Jedediah took a slow step forward, then another. He stopped, leaving a respectful distance between them. He could see her face more clearly now. The years had carved fine lines around her eyes, but they were the same eyes, a deep, steady gray that held no illusions. He expected her to speak first, to ask what he was doing here, to tell him to leave. He had rehearsed answers to a dozen different questions, but her voice, when it came, was not what he expected. It was low and steady, stripped of all emotion, sharp and direct as the point of a sewing needle. "Before you take another step, Jedediah," she said, her gaze unwavering, "there's something you ought to know." He waited. The wind seemed to die down, as if holding its breath to listen. She swallowed, a small, tight movement in her throat. "I'm not the same. I am not pure." The word hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. It was a word men used to claim ownership, to place value, to judge. It was a confession, a warning, and a dare, all at once. She was drawing a line in the dust, giving him the chance to turn his horse and ride away, to leave her to the solitude she had clearly chosen. She was telling him what the world had done to her, what it had taken from her. In the rigid set of her shoulders, he saw the countless nights she must have lain awake with that word pressing on her chest, the countless towns where whispers must have followed her like stray dogs. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not the ghost of the girl from his memory, but the woman standing before him, braced for rejection, for pity, for disgust. He saw the strength it took for her to say that word aloud to him, to face him with the piece of her past that was meant to be her shame. Jedediah felt the weariness in his bones begin to recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce clarity. He let the reins fall from his hand. They hit the ground with a soft, leathery sigh. He took off his hat, holding it by the brim in front of him, a gesture of respect, of peace. The wind ruffled his own dusty hair. His reply was quiet, so quiet it was almost carried away by the breeze, but it reached her as clearly as if he had laid a hand on her shoulder. "Abigail," he said, his voice gentle but firm, stripped of judgment, "I never asked you to be." The impact of his words was not explosive. It was a deep, seismic shift, a silent tremor that ran through the ground between them. He saw it in the way the tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. He saw it in the slight, involuntary parting of her lips, as if a breath she had been holding for 5 years had finally been released. The rifle, held so rigidly, lowered another inch. A border had been erased. He had not stepped over the line she had drawn. He had simply shown her it was never there for him to begin with. The shame she carried was hers alone. But he would not help her carry it. He was here for the woman, not for the ghost of what she thought she should have been. The warmth of the lamplight from the open door seemed to beckon, a small circle of peace in the growing dark. It promised shelter from the wind that was beginning to bite with the chill of the coming night. For the first time, a flicker of something other than defiance entered her eyes. It was not hope, not yet. It was something more fragile, the possibility of rest. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and stepped back, holding the door open for him. It was an invitation. As Jedediah bent to retrieve the reins, his eyes swept the tree line that bordered the far edge of the prairie, a dark, jagged wall of pines a quarter-mile distant. The last vestiges of sunlight were gone, and the woods were a place of deep, impenetrable shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shape darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting between the trunks of 2 ancient pines. He froze, his senses instantly on alert. He listened, straining to hear anything over the whisper of the wind, the snap of a twig, the nervous stamp of a hoof, the jingle of a bit. There was nothing, only the wind and the vast, humming silence of the plains. He told himself it was a trick of the fading light, a shape conjured by a tired mind. But the feeling of being watched prickled the back of his neck. The warm light from Abigail's cabin felt like a sanctuary, but the darkness surrounding it suddenly felt alive, watchful. He wondered, with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the night air, if their quiet moment of reckoning had been shared. He wondered if someone, or something, had been listening from the shadows. The inside of the cabin was a world made of wood and firelight. The air was warm, thick with the scent of burning pine, dust, and something else. The faint, clean smell of dried herbs that hung in small bunches from the rafters. It was a simple, one-room space. But every object had its place and purpose. A narrow bed covered with a patchwork quilt was pushed against one wall. A sturdy wooden trunk at its foot. A small table with 2 chairs stood in the center, its surface scrubbed clean. In the corner, a cast-iron stove radiated a steady, comforting heat, its firebox glowing orange through the grate. Jedediah stepped over the threshold, bringing the chill of the outside in with him. He closed the door, and the sound of the wind was instantly muted, reduced to a low moan around the edges of the frame. The latch fell into place with a solid, definitive click. For a moment, the two of them were sealed inside the quiet warmth. The vast, dark plains held at bay. He walked to the table and placed his hat on its surface, crown down. It was a gesture of respect in another man's home, but here, it felt like something more. It was the setting down of a burden, the shedding of the trail. His hands, gloved in a fine layer of dust, moved to the collar of his coat, brushing away the grit of his long journey. His movements were slow, deliberate, the actions of a man conserving his energy. Yet everyone was filled with an unspoken significance. He was not a guest passing through. He was a man who had arrived. Abigail had turned away from him, moving toward the stove. He watched her back, the straight line of her spine beneath the worn fabric of the coat. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived alone, where no gesture was wasted. She picked up a heavy kettle from the stovetop, her arm steady, but he saw the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted it. She was a fortress, but he had seen the crack in the stone. She took 2 tin cups from a shelf and placed them on the table. Then she poured the steaming water. The rising vapor caught the lamplight, momentarily shrouding her face in a soft, white mist, hiding her expression from him. It was as if she had pulled a veil between them, retreating back into the safety of her solitude after the raw vulnerability of her confession on the porch. He understood. Words like the ones she had spoken took a toll, leaving the speaker exposed and raw. The silence that followed was a necessary balm. She pushed one of the cups across the table toward him. As he reached for it, her fingers, still wrapped around the cup's base for balance, brushed against his. It was not a jolt of lightning. It was quieter, more profound, a thin current of heat, of life, that passed from her skin to his. It was the first time they had touched in 5 years, and the brief contact held the weight of all that had happened in the intervening time. It was a touch that spoke of shared memories from a sunnier, more innocent time, and of the chasm that had opened between them since. He felt the slight roughness of a callus on her thumb, a testament to the hard work that now defined her days. A man in a hurry, a man with less patience, would have pulled his hand back as if burned. Jedediah did not. He let his fingers linger for a heartbeat longer than necessary. A silent acknowledgement of the moment. He saw her own hand freeze, her knuckles white against the dark tin. She didn't pull away either. In that shared stillness, a fragile bridge was built across the chasm. Finally, he closed his hand around the cup, and the connection was broken. He lifted it, blowing gently on the steam, his eyes never leaving her face as she took her own seat opposite him. The fire popped and hissed in the stove, filling the silence. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping a branch against the roof like a restless finger. Abigail stared down into her cup, watching the steam curl and dissipate. Jedediah broke the quiet. His voice was low, matching the hushed intimacy of the room. I wasn't looking for the girl I knew, Abigail. Her head came up, her gray eyes searching his. People change, he continued, choosing his words carefully. The trail changes you, the weather changes you, time changes you. It's the way of things. A person isn't the sum of all their yesterdays. They're what they choose to be when the sun comes up this morning. He took a sip of the hot water. That's all that matters. This morning. He was not offering forgiveness, because his words made it clear there was nothing in his mind to forgive. He was not offering pity. He was offering something far more rare and valuable: acceptance. He was seeing her, the woman sitting across from him in a dusty coat, and telling her that she was enough. He watched as his words landed. He saw her throat work as she swallowed. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of judgment being unburdened, of a heavy stone she had been forced to carry finally being lifted. She had walked through towns where that single word impure had defined her, where it had closed doors and drawn whispers. She had met men whose eyes held a flicker of contempt or a predatory gleam when they heard her story. She had built this solitary life to escape that word. And here, in her own sanctuary, the one man whose judgment she might have feared most had just told her it meant nothing to him. A slow, weary smile touched her lips. It was a ghost of a thing, fragile and fleeting, but it was the most genuine expression he had seen from her since he arrived. It held no joy. Not yet. It was the smile of a soldier laying down their arms after a long, lonely war. It was the smile of pure, unadulterated relief. The fortress walls were coming down, stone by painful stone. "You were always a strange man, Jedediah," she whispered, her voice a little rough. "Too decent for your own good." Before he could reply, a violent gust of wind slammed into the cabin. The entire structure shuddered. The window pane rattled in its frame, and the iron door hinge let out a loud, groaning shriek. The flame in the oil lamp danced wildly, casting frantic, leaping shadows across the walls. The brief, fragile peace of the room was shattered, and the menace of the outside world rushed back in. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, the quiet man replaced by the watchful one. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the wooden bar that secured it. He listened. Abigail watched him, her own body tense, the fleeting smile gone. "It's just the wind," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It gets loud out here." "Sometimes," he said, his eyes on the door. "But that gust had a fist in it." He lifted the bar and pulled the door open a crack, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The wind tore at him, cold and sharp. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him to keep the warmth in the cabin. The night was moonless, the stars obscured by a high, thin layer of clouds. The world was a canvas of black on black. He stood motionless, letting his eyes adjust, expanding his senses beyond sight. He listened past the roar of the wind, trying to catch any sound that was out of place. He strained to see the dark shape of the tree line. The feeling he'd had earlier, of being watched, returned with a vengeance. It was a primal instinct, honed by years of living in wild places where a man's life could depend on noticing the wrong shape in the shadows or the wrong sound on the wind. And then he heard it. It was faint, almost lost in the gale, a metallic chink, followed by a muffled scrape. It was not the sound of a horseshoe on stone. This was sharper, more deliberate. It was the sound of iron on iron, a buckle being tightened, a rifle barrel tapping against a saddle horn. It was a sound a man makes when he is trying to be quiet and failing. It came from the direction of the trees. He backed away slowly, slipping back inside the cabin and securing the door, his movements swift and silent. Abigail was standing by the table, her hand resting near the rifle she had left there. The question was in her eyes. He didn't try to lie to her. He owed her more than that. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice low and certain. "In the trees." Fear flickered in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar, grim resignation. She knew what kind of men lingered in the dark on the edges of settled lands. She knew the dangers a woman living alone could attract. She looked from him to the door, then back again. "You should go. "Jedediah, this isn't your trouble." He walked back to the table and picked up his cup, his movements calm and steady. "I rode 3 days to get here," he said, looking at her over the rim of the cup. "I'm not leaving now." He took a slow sip. "Some things a man shouldn't leave behind, not twice." The last 2 words were a quiet admission of his own past failure, his own regret for not being there when she had needed him 5 years ago. It was a vow. He set the cup down and walked back to the door, needing one last look, needing to confirm what his gut was telling him. He took the lamp from the table, shielding its flame with his hand, and stepped back out onto the porch. He held the light low, casting a pool of yellow across the packed earth in front of the cabin. At first, he saw nothing but his own boot prints and the older, faded tracks of her horse. But then he angled the light toward the water trough, to the edge of the darkness, and he saw them, cut sharply into the damp ground, clear as day in the lamplight, was a partial print of a horseshoe, and another next to it. They were fresh, so fresh. He could see the clean, sharp edges of the compressed earth. They hadn't been there an hour ago when he'd first arrived. Someone had stood right here, at the very edge of the light spilling from her window, watching, listening. They had stood here while she had laid her soul bare, and while he had given his answer, the sound he'd heard from the trees wasn't someone arriving. It was someone retreating, melting back into the darkness after they had heard all they needed to hear. They weren't just passing through. They had been watching the cabin. They had been watching her, and now they knew she wasn't alone anymore. Dawn did not arrive. It seeped into the world, a slow, gray bleed that leached the black from the sky. It was a cold dawn, the kind that makes the iron of a gun feel like a piece of ice against the skin. The wind had died in the night, and its absence was more unsettling than its howl. The silence was absolute, creating a vacuum where every sound was magnified, distorted, and carried for unnatural distances. A crow's call from a mile away sounded as if it were on the roof. The air felt thin, hollow, as if the world were holding its breath. Jedediah knew this kind of quiet. It was the quiet that came before a storm, or before trouble. He was already outside, a specter in the gloom, having slipped out of the cabin while Abigail slept a fitful, shallow sleep in the chair by the cold stove. He had not slept. He had watched the window, listened to the silence, and felt the presence of the night's visitors like a change in pressure. Now, in the bruised light, he saw the proof. He walked back to the cabin door and pushed it open without a sound. Abigail was awake, sitting exactly as he had left her, the rifle still resting across her lap. Her eyes, wide in the dimness, met his. He didn't speak. He simply jerked his head toward the outside. She rose, her movement stiff, and followed him onto the porch. The cold air hit her, sharp and immediate. He pointed to the ground near the water trough, the spot he had illuminated with the lamp hours before. In the growing light, the story was written plain in the dirt for anyone who knew how to read it. The earth was savaged, torn up by hooves. These weren't the tracks of a single rider pausing to listen. This was the mark of a group. "They came back after I saw the first print," he said, his voice a low rumble. He knelt, his long fingers tracing the edge of a deep crescent-shaped gouge in the soil. "Ridden hard. See how the dirt is thrown back? They wheeled their horses here, fast." He moved a few feet away, his eyes scanning the chaotic cluster of prints. "There's 3. No." He pointed to a fainter set of tracks overlying the others. 4 horses. They sat here for a time, watching the cabin. Then they left, riding east toward the trees. Abigail stared at the churned-up ground, and a visible tremor went through her. The blood drained from her face, leaving it the color of ash. Her hand went to her throat, a small, protective gesture, as if to ward off a choking memory. This was not a new fear. He saw in her eyes the ghosts of other men, other threats. He saw the reason she had built her life in this solitary place. and the terrible realization that her solitude had not been a shield after all. It had been a beacon. "The last time," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "The last time men came here uninvited, they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The memory was a living thing in her eyes, a shadow of profound violation and helplessness. Jedediah rose to his feet. He looked at her, at the stark terror that had momentarily broken through her fortress of composure. He felt a cold, hard knot of anger tighten in his gut. An anger directed not at her, but at the faceless men who had put that look in her eyes. His response was not to offer soft words of comfort. The time for words was past. Now was the time for iron and wood and careful planning. He turned and went back inside the cabin, his long-legged stride full of purpose. Abigail followed, closing the door and dropping the thick wooden bar into its brackets with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the small space, a note of finality. They were sealed in. Without a word, Jedediah walked to where he had left his gun belt hanging on the back of a chair. He drew the Colt revolver, its metal gleaming dully in the gray light filtering through the window. The weight of it in his hand was familiar, grounding. He broke it open, spinning the cylinder with his thumb. The soft, mechanical click-click-click was the only sound in the room. He checked the load, his thumb brushing over the brass casing of each of the 6 cartridges. Satisfied, he snapped the revolver shut and slid it back into its holster. Next, he picked up his rifle, a Winchester that had leaned against the wall by the door. His actions were fluid, economical, honed by countless hours of practice until they were as natural as breathing. He worked the lever, ejecting the chambered round into his palm and inspecting it before sliding it back into the magazine. He counted the remaining bullets in his belt loops. He had enough. For now. He moved to the door, testing the heavy bar, pushing against it with his shoulder to feel its strength. He ran a hand over the thick log walls, then peered through a small chink near the window frame, scanning the landscape outside. Every movement was calm, precise, and sure. It was the focused, deadly grace of a man who knew violence and did not fear it, but respected its terrible power. He was not a man who sought trouble, but he was a man who would meet it head-on when it came for him. He turned back to face Abigail. She had not moved from the center of the room, her own rifle held in a white-knuckled grip. Her fear was still there, but watching him, seeing his unshakable competence, had banked its fires. "They'll be back," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Men like that, they enjoy the game. They've had their look. Now they'll come to play." He took a step closer to her. "We need a plan. Words will be a luxury we might not have, so we'll use signals." He looked at her, holding her gaze, ensuring he had her full attention. "If I put my hand on your shoulder, just once, like this," he demonstrated, his large, calloused hand resting on her for a brief moment. "You get down, go to the floor, and you stay flat, no matter what you hear. You understand?" She gave a tight, jerky nod. "If I touch you twice," he continued, tapping her shoulder twice with his fingertips, "you go to that corner, behind the flour barrel. It's the thickest part of the cabin, farthest from the door and window. You get behind it, and you do not move. You do not make a sound. You stay there until I come and get you. Promise me, Abigail." "I promise," she breathed, the words barely audible. Good. The plan was simple, brutal in its clarity. It was a plan built for survival. Now, they worked together, a silent, efficient team. Abigail went to the window and untied the thin cords that held up the simple muslin curtain. The cloth fell, covering the glass pane and plunging the room into a deep, shadowy twilight. She then went to the lamp, turned down the wick until it was just a red ember, and blew it out. The smell of hot metal and extinguished kerosene filled the air. The cabin was now a dark box, a blind fortress. It felt safer, hidden from the prying eyes he knew were out there. while she secured the inside. Jedediah unbarred the door and slipped out again. He moved to the side of the cabin where he had left Dust Devil tied. The horse whickered softly, sensing the tension in the air. Jedediah murmured to the animal, stroking its neck, before untying the reins. He led the roan quietly around to the back of the cabin, a small, sheltered space where a lean-to had been built to store firewood. The horse would be invisible from the front and from the direction of the woods. His work wasn't done. He looked down at the fresh tracks he and Abigail had just made in the soft earth. He looked at the deep prints left by the 4 riders. Evidence. Information. He found a long, thick pine branch with a full spray of needles and began to sweep the ground, walking backward as he did. He erased their own tracks leading to the back of the cabin. He scuffed and blurred the sharp edges of the riders' hoof prints, making them look older, less distinct. It was a small deception, but in a fight, small deceptions could buy you time, and time was life. He tossed the branch into the wood pile and walked back to the front of the cabin, his boots making no sound on the ground he had just disturbed. He stepped back inside, sliding the bar home for what felt like the final time. The world was now definitively split into 2 spaces inside and outside, here and there, them and us. He took up his post near the door, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. He did not sit, he stood, a silent sentinel, his body positioned between the door and Abigail. She had sunk onto the small stool by the hearth, her own rifle held across her knees, its muzzle pointed at the floor. The silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with anticipation. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to say. All the promises that mattered had already been made, not in words, but in action, in the checking of a gun, the drawing of a curtain, the sweeping of the earth. His promise was in his posture, in the solid, immovable fact of his presence. "I will stand at the door," his silence said, "so you can be still. I will meet what comes, so you do not have to." It was the most profound vow he had ever made. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the soft whisper of their own breathing and the frantic, hammering beat of their hearts. The gray light in the room barely shifted. The world seemed frozen, waiting. Then, a sound cut through the stillness. It came from the trees. It was not a gunshot, not a shout of challenge. It was a laugh, low and guttural, thick with malice. It was a sound that belonged to a predator that knows its prey is trapped. The ugly, brutish noise rolled across the empty prairie, seeped through the log walls of the cabin, and filled the silence with its raw, naked threat. They had been seen. The game was beginning. The weight was a physical thing. It settled in the hollows of their collarbones and coiled in the pits of their stomachs. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of gray light across the cabin floor, which then faded back into the deep, suffocating black of a moonless night. The silence returned, no longer empty, but charged with a venomous potential. Every creak of the cooling stove, every rustle of a mouse in the thatch, was a gunshot in the waiting dark. Then, through a tiny chink in the log wall, a pinprick of light appeared. It was in the direction of the trees, a single, unsteady star where no star should be. As Jedediah watched, his eyes narrowed to slits. The light swayed, a drunken dance in the distance. Another light joined it, then a third. 3 bobbing, weaving points of fire, like will-o'-the-wisps leading not to treasure, but to damnation. They were lanterns, held by men on horseback, and they were coming closer. A 4th light flared to life, farther to the right, as if another rider had just struck a match. The trap was closing. The first sound was the dull, rhythmic thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth. It was a slow, deliberate sound, the pace of men who are sure of their destination and in no hurry to arrive. The sound grew, separating into the distinct footfalls of 4 horses. They were not riding in a tight group, but spread out, a loose cordon tightening around the tiny cabin. The hoofbeats stopped, A new sound took over, the crunch of boots on the dry ground, the soft, metallic jingle of spurs, a low, guttural cough. They were on the porch. The silence that followed was the loudest sound yet. It was a loaded, breathing silence, thick with menace. Abigail, huddled on her stool, had stopped breathing altogether. Her knuckles were bone white where she gripped her rifle. She could feel her own heart, a frantic drum beating against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Then the door exploded with sound. Boom, boom, boom! It wasn't a knock. It was the impact of a heavy fist, a blow meant to shatter, not to request entry. The entire cabin vibrated with the force of it. Dust motes, invisible moments before, rained down from the rafters in the faint slivers of starlight that pierced the gloom. A voice roared from the other side, thick with liquor and arrogance. "Hello, the house. Got some weary travelers out here in need of a fire and a bottle. Open up." The voice was a lie. There was no weariness in it, only a raw, predatory power. It was the voice of a man used to taking what he wanted, a voice that had never learned the meaning of the word no. Jedediah stood motionless in the shadows beside the door, a pillar of darkness against the log wall. He did not move, did not flinch. He let the echoes of the pounding fade, let the demand hang in the air. When he spoke, his voice was unnaturally calm, level, and carried a quiet authority that cut through the bluster outside. "This cabin is occupied," he said, his words clear and precise. "Keep riding. You'll find no welcome here." A beat of stunned silence from the porch was followed by a burst of derisive laughter. It was a cruel, ugly sound, shared by several men. "Occupied," the big voice boomed again, mocking him. "Well now, ain't that friendly? We don't need a welcome. Friend, just the fire, and the liquor, and maybe a little company for the night." The last words were drawn out, heavy with a greasy insinuation that made Abigail's skin crawl. A heavy shoulder thudded against the door, right next to where Jedediah stood. The wood groaned, the sound of fibers straining under immense pressure. The heavy oak bar he had dropped into place bowed visibly in the near darkness. It held, but it sang a high, mournful note of protest. The men outside were testing the cabin's defenses, enjoying the fear they imagined they were causing. Abigail let out a small, choked gasp, a sound she couldn't hold back. Her lungs burned for air, but she was too terrified to draw a full breath. The corner, the dark corner behind the flour barrel, seemed 1,000 miles away. Her legs felt like water, her limbs frozen by a primal fear. In the darkness, she felt a presence beside her. Jedediah had moved from the door with the silence of a hunting cat. She didn't see him until his hand rested gently on her shoulder. One firm, steady touch. "The signal! Get down!" The command, delivered without a single word, broke the paralysis that held her. It was a connection to another human being, a reminder that she was not alone in the terrifying darkness. She obeyed instantly, sliding off the stool and onto the rough-hewn floorboards. She pressed herself flat against the wood, the splinters digging into her cheek, her rifle clutched tightly to her chest. She was hidden now, below the level of the window, a smaller target in the suffocating black. From her new vantage point, the sounds from outside were even more terrifying. The scraping of a boot on the porch boards, a low mutter of conversation she couldn't quite make out. Then a sharp, metallic shang. It was the sound of a large knife being drawn from a leather sheath. Through a crack in the door at floor level, a sliver of lantern light cut into the cabin's gloom. In that fleeting beam, Abigail saw a flash of polished steel, an obscene glint of reflected light from the edge of a blade. Someone was running their thumb along the edge, or perhaps using it to pick at the door frame, a casual gesture of intimidation. They were armed, and they were patient. Jedediah had moved again. He didn't dive or scramble. He took one long, gliding step to his left, shifting his position from beside the door to the solid log wall that separated the main room from the small lean-to at the back. It was a subtle, calculated movement. Abigail understood its purpose instantly. The front wall, with its door and window, was the most likely place for a bullet to tear through. But the wall he now stood against was the thickest in the cabin. 2 layers of timber where the lean-to joined the main structure. If a stray shot came through the door, it would have to pass through the empty space where he had been standing and bury itself in the solid wood behind him. He had placed himself in the safest position. Not to hide, but to fight. He was using the cabin's strength to his advantage, turning their prison into his fortress. The men on the porch fell quiet again. The silence stretched, taut and thin. Abigail could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Why weren't they trying the door again? What were they waiting for? The answer came not as a sound, but as a change in sound. The crunch of boots was no longer on the wooden porch in front of her. It was on the dirt and dry grass, and it was moving. Moving along the side of the cabin, toward the curtained window. She heard a low murmur of voices. Farther away now, but distinct. They weren't leaving. They hadn't given up. They were circling, like wolves, testing the perimeter for another way in. They were going for the window at the back. The sound from the back of the cabin was not loud. It was a soft, scraping noise, like a leather sack being dragged over rough wood. It was the sound of a man trying to be quiet. Jedediah, positioned against the thickest wall, heard it instantly. His whole body went still, his ears straining, filtering out the low moan of the wind. He pictured the window in his mind, a simple wooden shutter on the outside, a glass pane on the inside, covered by Abigail's curtain. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low grunt of effort, followed by the faint, protesting squeal of wood under pressure. They were prying at the shutter, lying on the floor. Abigail heard it too. A fresh wave of cold fear washed over her, and she pressed her face harder into the rough floorboards, as if she could will herself to disappear into the very grain of the wood. Then came a new sound. From inside, a sharp, loud creak. It was a floorboard near the back wall, a board that had always settled and complained under the slightest weight. One of the attackers, having forced the shutter and climbed onto the windowsill, had put his weight on the interior frame. The house itself had betrayed his presence. From the outside came a hissed curse. The man had heard it too. He was hesitating, caught. In that split second of hesitation, Jedediah moved. To his right was the small pile of firewood they had brought in for the stove. His hand closed around a thick, seasoned log of oak. It was heavy, solid in his palm. He didn't rise, he didn't take aim. He simply pivoted on his heel, his arm swinging in a low, powerful arc, and hurled the log underhand toward the back corner of the cabin. The log flew through the darkness and crashed into the wall with a tremendous, splintering thud. A foot to the left of the window, it sounded like a battering ram. A startled yelp came from the window, followed by a string of furious, panicked curses. The man, thinking he was under direct attack, scrambled backward. Abigail heard the heavy thump of his body landing on the hard ground outside. The immediate threat from the window was gone. The simple, brutal distraction had worked. But it was only a moment's reprieve. The attack had been clumsy, but it showed they were committed. A new sense of desperate energy surged through Abigail, overriding her fear. She was not a sack of flour to be defended. She was a woman in her own home, and she would not die cowering on the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild in the gloom, searching for a way to help, a way to fight back. Her gaze fell upon the large, heavy barrel of flour in the corner, the very spot Jedediah had designated as her sanctuary. It was more than sanctuary. She realized it was a weapon, with a strength born of adrenaline. She gripped the lip of the barrel and pulled. It was heavy, resisting her with a dead weight, but she dug her heels in, her muscles screaming in protest. She wasn't trying to move it far, just to pull it out from the corner, to create a better, more solid barricade. The barrel tilted, scraped across the floor. Then its center of gravity shifted. It tipped over with a heavy, booming crash. The lid flew off. A huge, thick cloud of white flour billowed into the air. It was instantaneous, an explosion of fine, powdery dust that filled the entire cabin. It was like a dense, choking fog. It clogged Abigail's nose and mouth, the dry taste of it coating her tongue. She coughed, her eyes streaming. Through the white haze, she could just make out Jedediah's dark shape. He too was coughing, but he was already turning their mishap into a tactic. He strode toward the front of the cabin, his boots kicking up more clouds of the white dust. He put his mouth close to a chink in the door. "Caleb, watch that back window," he roared, his voice booming and distorted by the enclosed space. "He's trying to circle around. Don't fire until you see the rest of them." He paused, then shouted again, this time toward the roof. "Hank, you see anything from up there?" It was a masterful piece of theater. The shouts, coming from the dust-filled cabin, sounded frantic. Chaotic, the sounds of a group of men preparing a defense. To the attackers outside, their vision now obscured by the flour puffing out from the cracks in the walls. It would create a moment of profound uncertainty. How many men were in there? Was there someone in a loft? The response from outside was a furious, snarling voice, the leader. "He's lying. There's only one man. He's trying to spook us, Silas. Get a torch if he won't come out. We'll burn him out. Light up the porch roof." Abigail's blood ran cold. Fire. It was the ultimate weapon against a wooden house. It was the one thing they could not fight from the inside. A moment later, a new light appeared. It wasn't the steady, swaying light of the lanterns. It was a flickering, angry orange, casting dancing shadows against the front wall. She could hear the crackle of a torch. Then a whoosh as it was thrust into the dry thatch of the porch roof. The smell of smoke, sharp and acrid, instantly filled the cabin. A shower of brilliant, terrifying sparks rained down past the window. They were like a swarm of angry fireflies, each one a promise of destruction. They were trapped. The law was a day's ride away. Their nearest neighbor was 5 miles of empty prairie. There was no one to call for, no one to come. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the two of them. They were an island in a sea of violence, and the sea was closing in. Before the flames could truly take hold, Jedediah acted. He threw the bar from the door. The heavy oak slammed against the floor. He ripped his heavy canvas coat from its peg and, without a moment's hesitation, flung the door open and charged out into the night. Abigail screamed his name, a sound swallowed by the roar of the nascent fire. She saw his silhouette for a split second, framed against the orange flames, before he disappeared onto the porch. She heard the frantic, heavy whump, whump, whump of his coat as he beat at the burning thatch. She didn't freeze. Her mind, sharpened by the imminent threat, worked with a cold, desperate clarity. Water. She spun around, her eyes darting through the floury haze. The water bucket by the stove, it was half full. She grabbed it, the metal handle biting into her fingers. It was heavy, sloshing over her feet, but she didn't care. She ran to the open doorway. The scene on the porch was chaos. Jedediah was a whirlwind of motion, batting at the hungry flames that were licking up the dry wooden posts. The leader and another man were backing away from the heat, laughing, watching the show. "Jedediah!" she screamed. He glanced at her, his face grim and smudged with soot, his eyes burning with intensity. He saw the bucket. He didn't have to say a word. He beat down a final patch of flame and stumbled back as she swung the bucket with all her might. A wave of water flew through the air and crashed against the smoldering roof beams. It hit with a loud hiss, sending a massive plume of steam and smoke into the night sky. The orange glow vanished, replaced by a sullen, smoking blackness. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The 4 attackers stared, their amusement turning to disbelief. They had expected their victims to cower inside, to choke on the smoke. They hadn't expected this sudden, coordinated counterattack. Jedediah and Abigail stood side by side in the doorway. He with his smoking coat, she with the empty bucket. They were panting, their faces grimy, their lungs aching, but they were together. In that moment of shared, desperate action, something had fused between them. They were no longer a man and a woman with a broken past. They were a single unit, a two-person army fighting for their lives. The leader recovered first. The laughter was gone from his voice, replaced by a low, vicious snarl. He took a step forward into the dim light cast by his men's lanterns, and for the first time, Abigail saw his face. He was a big man with a thick, tangled beard and small, cruel eyes that glittered with a cold fire. He ignored Jedediah, his gaze fixing on Abigail with a terrifying, possessive intensity. The pretense of needing fire and liquor was gone. Now, the truth came out, raw and ugly. "Enough of these games," the leader growled, his voice a low threat. "We know what's in this cabin. We know who you are. We came for the girl. Send her out, and the man can ride away with his life." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. The girl. He said it as if she were a piece of property, a stray calf to be claimed. In his voice, she heard the echoes of every leering stare, every whispered rumor, every ounce of shame she had carried for 5 long years. He was not just a random marauder. He was the embodiment of the past that had haunted her, the past that had driven her into this wilderness. The darkness she had run from had found her, and it had a face and a name. She felt the strength drain out of her, replaced by the old, familiar ice of helpless terror. She was not a fighter. She was just a woman who had been marked as spoiled, as public property by the cruel judgment of other men. Jedediah stepped forward slightly, placing himself fully in front of her, shielding her with his body. He tossed his smoldering coat to the ground. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered Colt, his thumb brushing the hammer. He didn't look at Abigail. His eyes were locked on the leader, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. There was no bargaining in his voice, no pleading, no attempt to reason, just a flat, final, and absolute refusal. "There's no one here for the taking," Jedediah said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the porch with the deadly weight of a falling axe. "You've made your play. Now you can either ride away, or you can be buried here. It makes no difference to me." He was not just protecting her. He was defending her honor, her very personhood, in the face of the man who sought to strip it all away. He had not come here to save her from her past. He had come here to stand with her in her present, and in that moment, he accepted all the violence that this stand would bring. He was not giving them a choice. He was drawing a line in the ashes of the porch, a line that he would die on before he let them cross. They scrambled back inside, Jedediah pulling the heavy door shut and dropping the bar into its brackets with a resounding thud. The cabin was a chaotic mess, the air thick with the acrid stench of burnt thatch, the choking haze of flour, and the metallic tang of fear. For a long moment, they stood in the darkness, their harsh, ragged breaths the only sound, the chaos on the porch having momentarily subsided into a tense, watchful quiet. The leader's words echoed in the small space. "More damaging than any fist or flame. We came for the girl." The words stripped Abigail of the strength she had found in their shared defiance. They were a brand, a label seared onto her soul, and in that moment, she was no longer Abigail, the homesteader, the survivor. She was just the girl, a tarnished object of gossip and desire. The darkness of the cabin dissolved, and, in her mind, she was standing in the blinding sun of a dozen other towns. She remembered a general store in Kansas, the way the storekeeper's wife's smile became thin and brittle when she learned her name. She remembered the whispers that followed her down the dusty main street, whispers that felt like tiny, sharp stones thrown at her back. In a small town in the Nebraska Territory, the blacksmith had offered her work mending clothes, his eyes holding a look that had nothing to do with sewing and everything to do with what he thought he could take from her. The rumors were like burrs caught on a wool coat, impossible to fully remove. They clung to her, twisting her story into something ugly and unrecognizable. She had been the victim of a brutal, senseless act, but in the telling and retelling, the blame had somehow migrated to her. She was the one who was unlucky, the one who attracted trouble, the one whose past was a stain that could never be washed clean. She had fled from town to town, seeking not a new life, but simply anonymity, a place where she could be invisible, where she could work and sleep without feeling the weight of judging eyes. This cabin, this desolate patch of prairie, was supposed to be the end of that running. It was her final, desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of who she used to be. And now, the ghost had found her. She sank onto the stool by the hearth, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy in her lap. A profound, bone-deep weariness settled over her, the exhaustion of a 5-year flight. What was the point of fighting? They would always come, men like the one outside, men who saw her not as a person, but as a story they could add a final, ugly chapter to. The fight seemed hopeless, the running endless. Then, cutting through the fog of her despair, another voice echoed in her memory, a quiet voice, spoken in the twilight just the night before. "I never asked you to be." Jedediah's words. They weren't loud or heroic. They were a simple statement of fact, but they were the first stones laid in the foundation of a new reality for her. He had not looked at her and seen a tarnished object. He had looked at her and seen her. He had seen Abigail. The words were an anchor, a single, solid point in a swirling sea of shame. They had been a gift, and she realized now, with a clarity that pierced her fear, that she had not yet truly accepted it. To accept it meant she had to believe it. It meant she had to believe she was worthy of being defended, not because she was pure or perfect, but simply because she was. The anchor held. The memories of the judging eyes and the cruel whispers began to recede, pushed back by the simple power of his acceptance. She looked up, her eyes finding his dark shape in the flowery gloom. He was not looking at the door, or the window. He was watching her. He saw the war in her eyes, the flicker of old ghosts. He knew what the leader's words had done to her. He walked over and knelt in front of her, taking the heavy Winchester from her unresisting hands and leaning it against the wall beside them. The air was thick with things unsaid. "My father," he began, his voice a low murmur, barely disturbing the dust motes dancing in the faint light. He was a farmer from Ohio. When the war came, he joined up, like everyone else. He wrote letters to my mother about honor, about the Union. Jedediah paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. Then came the battle at Shiloh. 1,000 men died in an orchard, and the air was so thick with lead you could taste it. He saw the man next to him torn apart. He saw boys, no older than 16, screaming for their mothers as they bled out in the mud, and something inside him broke. He looked back up at Abigail, his eyes filled with a distant, inherited pain. He dropped his rifle, and he ran. He didn't stop running until he was in Missouri. They called him a deserter, a coward. The words hung in the air between them. Jedediah had never told anyone this story. It was his own private shame, a shadow that had shaped the course of his life. "We had to leave Ohio," he continued. "The word followed us, the looks, the whispers. That's the coward's boy. My ma, she held her head high, but I saw her crying at night. When I came of age, no man wanted to hire me for honest work. They looked at me, and they didn't see me. They saw my father's ghost. They saw his shame. So I learned to use a gun. I learned to live on the trail. Out there, a man is what he can do, not who his father was." He took a breath. "But the label, it follows you. A different kind of label than yours. Maybe, but it's a cage all the same. People decide who you are before you ever speak a word." In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. Abigail looked at this quiet, capable man, this pillar of strength who had faced down fire and threats without flinching, and she saw not a hero, but a fellow traveler. She saw another soul who had been judged by a world that was too quick to condemn and too slow to understand. His cage was made of cowardice, hers of impurity. But they were cages just the same, built by the words of others. They understood each other in a way that no one else ever could. Outside, a horse stomped its hoof, a restless, impatient sound. The threat was still there, waiting. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. The fear was still present, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. Slowly, Abigail reached out her hand. Jedediah met her halfway, his large, calloused hand enveloping hers. His skin was rough, laced with the scars of rope burns and hard living, but his grip was gentle, a circle of warmth in the cold, dark room. It was not a lover's touch. Not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was the touch of allies, of survivors. It was the touch of two people who had been alone for a very long time, and suddenly were not. "That man out there," Jedediah said, his voice low and fierce, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "He and his kind. They get to decide a lot of things in this world. They get to decide where the trail goes, who gets rich, and who gets buried. But I swear to you, Abigail, as long as I am breathing, they will not get to decide what you are worth. They will not define you with their filth." It was a vow, spoken in the heart of the siege, a promise of a battle that was about more than just survival. It was a battle for her soul. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of fear or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that left her breathless. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of a future that was not defined by running. For the first time, she dared to hope, and that hope was terrifying, because it gave her something to lose. It gave her him to lose. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had ever asked anything of him, the first time she had presumed to have a claim on his life. "Please, Jedediah, don't die for me." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. He squeezed her hand, a firm, reassuring pressure. "Dying is the easy part, Abigail," he said softly. "Any fool can do that. Living, that's the hard part. That's the part that takes courage." He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear it. "Living with you, that's the choice. That's what I'm fighting for." His words settled the last of the trembling in her heart and replaced it with a cold, hard resolve. He was not fighting for her past. He was fighting for their future. And she would be damned if she would let him do it alone. The tactical part of her mind, the part that had learned to survive, took over. "We can't stay in here," she said, her voice stronger now. "He was right. They'll just burn us out for real next time." Jedediah nodded, his expression shifting from protector to strategist. "I know. They're comfortable out there. They're in the dark, and we're in the box. They have all the advantages." He glanced toward the front of the cabin. "The wind is picking up again. It's coming from the west, blowing toward the trees." A plan began to form in his eyes. "They want us pinned down, so we do the last thing they expect. We go out, we force the fight into the open ground, between here and the woods, on our terms." He looked at her. "We can use the wind, a little smoke at the right time. It can be a better shield than a log wall." He was right. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, but it was better than waiting to be burned alive. It was a choice, and they were making it together. They began to move, preparing for the next phase of the fight. But before they could take their positions, the decision was made for them. Crack! The sound was sharp as a whip, deafening in the small cabin. It was followed instantly by the violent, splintering shriek of wood. A stray bullet, fired carelessly or as a random act of intimidation from one of the men outside, tore through the front door. It wasn't aimed. It was a random shot into the darkness. The bullet ripped through the thick oak, crossed the 20 feet of open space in the blink of an eye, and slammed into the back wall with a vicious thwack, sending a shower of wooden splinters into the air. The moment for planning was over. The time for waiting had ended. The battle had begun. The splintering crack of the bullet acted like a starting pistol. The time for thought was over. There was only instinct and action. The air, thick with flour and fear, now tasted of gunpowder and raw, splintered pine. "The window!" Jedediah's voice was a low, urgent command that cut through the ringing in Abigail's ears. "The one at the back! Get the straw from the mattress ticking! Now!" There was no hesitation. Abigail scrambled toward the narrow bed in the corner, her hands finding the rough burlap of the mattress. She ripped at the seam with her fingernails, pulling out handfuls of the dry, brittle straw stuffing. It was dusty and smelled of sleep and old sunlight. While she worked, Jedediah moved to the hearth. He grabbed a small iron skillet, and with a piece of kindling, he scooped a few glowing red embers from the deep belly of the stove. He moved with a swift, economical grace. A man who had faced sudden violence before and knew that wasted motion was a luxury you couldn't afford. Abigail gathered a large, loose bundle of the straw. It was light and insubstantial in her arms. "Go!" he commanded, handing her the skillet of glowing coals. "Push it through a crack in the shutter. Drop the embers in and pull your hand back. Fast!" She ran to the back of the cabin, to the window where the man had tried to enter. It was a small opening, barely big enough for a man to squeeze through. The wooden shutter on the outside was still slightly ajar from where they had pried at it. It was enough. Holding the straw in one hand, she carefully tilted the skillet with the other, her heart hammering against her ribs. The embers tumbled into the dry straw. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a tiny wisp of smoke curled upward, followed by a sudden, hungry whoosh as the straw ignited. It didn't burst into a massive flame, but into a thick, choking cloud of dense, white smoke. She shoved the smoldering bundle through the gap between the shutter and the window frame, letting it fall to the ground outside. At the exact same moment, Jedediah was at the front door. His hand was on the heavy oak bar. He gave Abigail a final, sharp glance, a look of trust, of shared purpose. Then, with one powerful motion, he lifted the bar and threw the door wide open. But he didn't charge straight out into the lantern light as the men outside would have expected. Instead, he lunged to the left, hugging the exterior wall of the cabin, and disappeared into the deep shadows at the corner of the house. He moved like a ghost, a dark shape against the dark logs, his revolver now firm in his hand. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. The two men who had been circling toward the back of the cabin were met with an unexpected face full of thick, acrid smoke from the burning straw. The westerly wind, their ally just moments before, turned against them. It caught the plume of smoke and drove it directly into their path, a blinding, suffocating wall of white. They stumbled back, coughing and choking, their eyes streaming. Their horses, startled by the sudden smoke and the smell of fire, shied violently, pulling at their reins and adding to the confusion. From the front, the leader and his remaining men saw the door fly open. They raised their rifles, expecting a target to appear in the doorway. But no one came. There was only the empty, dark maw of the cabin, now belching out a strange, flowery haze. They were momentarily baffled, their plan of a simple siege completely upended. From the deep shadows at the corner of the cabin, Jedediah's voice roared into the night, filled with a strength and volume that seemed to come from three men at once. "Hank, circle around. They're flushed out. Don't let 'em get back to the trees." The bluff was perfect. The name, simple and common, was utterly believable. To the disoriented men, coughing in the smoke, it sounded like a coordinated attack. They froze, their heads whipping around, trying to locate this new, unseen threat. Was there another man, a Hank, hiding in the darkness on the other side of the cabin? Had they walked into an ambush? The certainty that had fueled their cruelty began to crumble, replaced by the cold, creeping dread of the unknown. The leader, a man named Silas, was not a man accustomed to his plans going wrong. He was driven by a simple, brutal arrogance, and this sudden chaos enraged him. He could see no Hank. He saw only smoke, confusion, and the man who was making a fool of him. "It's a trick!" he bellowed, his voice raw with fury. He spurred his horse viciously, forcing the agitated animal forward, out of the main cloud of smoke and into the open space in front of the cabin. "There's no one else. It's just him." He charged, his heavy horse thundering across the few yards that separated them from the cabin. He was a terrifying sight. A large man on a large horse, a dark engine of destruction silhouetted against the lanterns of his men. Jedediah stepped out from the shadows to meet him. He didn't raise his gun. He simply stood there, in the middle of the open ground, his feet planted wide. He did not retreat a single inch. He was a silent, immovable object in the path of the charging beast, a challenge offered not with a weapon, but with sheer, unyielding presence. The horse, already spooked by the smoke and sensing the absolute lack of fear in the man before it, faltered. It slowed its charge, tossing its head and sidestepping, unwilling to crash into the calm figure who stood his ground. Silas cursed and kicked the horse's flanks, but its momentum was broken. It was then that Abigail acted. She had moved to the open doorway, her own rifle in hand. She had seen the charge, had seen Jedediah's incredible bravery. She was no longer a victim to be protected. She was his partner. She raised the barrel of the Winchester, not at the man, but at the empty, starless sky above him. She pulled the trigger. The explosion of the rifle was deafening, a sharp, cracking roar that was infinitely louder and more powerful than the crack of a pistol. The sound echoed across the silent prairie, multiplied by the vast emptiness. In the chaotic aftermath of the smoky confusion and the shouted commands, it did not sound like a single rifle shot. It sounded like a volley. It sounded like the arrival of the mythical Hank and a dozen of his friends. That was the final blow to the attackers' morale. For two of the men, it was too much. They were thugs and bullies, not soldiers. They had come for what they thought would be an easy prize, not a pitched battle against multiple, unseen defenders in the dark. One of them yelled something unintelligible and wheeled his horse around, galloping frantically back toward the safety of the trees. The second man, seeing his partner flee, hesitated for only a second before following him, his own panic overriding any loyalty he might have had to his leader. They vanished into the darkness, the sound of their desperate flight fading into the night. Now, only two remained: the furious leader, Silas, and one other man, a wiry, nervous-looking individual who clearly wished he were anywhere else but was too afraid of his boss to run. Silas sat on his dancing horse, his face a mask of pure, frustrated rage. His easy victory had turned into a humiliating rout. He had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and made to look like a fool. "Get out of here, Silas!" Jedediah's voice was low and cold, carrying a deadly finality. He still hadn't raised his pistol. He was giving the man one last chance to walk away. "Take your man and ride. Don't come back." For a moment, it seemed Silas might listen. He was outnumbered, or at least he believed he was. His men had deserted him, but his pride, wounded and raw, was a more powerful force than reason. With a guttural roar of pure fury, he spurred his horse into one last, desperate charge, pulling a long knife from his belt. He didn't make it 5 feet. The wind, which had been his enemy moments before, became Jedediah's final weapon. A strong gust swept across the prairie, picking up the fine, loose dust and the powdery flour that had spilled from the cabin. It created a sudden, gritty whirlwind that blew directly into the face of the charging man and his horse. Silas cried out, blinded by the sting of the dust. His horse, already on edge, reared up in terror, its front hooves flailing in the air. The man was a skilled rider, but the combination of the choking dust, the rearing horse, and the unnerving calm of the man on the ground was too much. He was thrown from the saddle, landing with a heavy, ignominious thud in the dirt. his last remaining man, seeing his leader unhorsed and the situation spiraling into complete disaster, made his choice. He yanked his horse's head around and fled, not even looking back. Silas scrambled to his feet, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes wild with a mixture of pain and impotent rage. He had lost. He had been thoroughly and completely defeated, not by a superior force of arms, but by cleverness, by courage, and by the unbreakable will of two people who refused to be victims. He stood there, panting, his knife still clutched in his hand, a pathetic and diminished figure. Jedediah finally raised his Colt, the long barrel pointing steadily at the man's chest. "It's over," he said. Silas stared down the barrel of the gun, then looked at the silent, determined woman standing in the cabin doorway with her rifle. He looked at the empty prairie where his men had been. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a venomous, seething hatred. He knew he was beaten for tonight, but his kind never truly gave up. They just retreated to gather more strength. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off Jedediah. "This ain't over," he hissed, his voice a low, threatening rasp. He spat a wad of bloody dust onto the ground. "You hear me? This ain't over. I'll be back, and I'll bring enough men to tear this shack down to the dirt and salt the earth where it stood. I'll bring 20 men. He continued backing away, then turned and ran clumsily into the darkness, chasing after his horse. The threat hung in the cold night air, a poisoned promise, a hook cast into the future. They had won the battle, but the war for their peace, for their lives, had just begun. The sun rose on a battlefield. The ground in front of the cabin was a mess of churned-up earth, scorched wood, and the lingering ghosts of violence. The air, usually clean and sharp, was stale with the smell of old smoke and spent gunpowder. They worked through the morning in a shared, weary silence, their movements slow and deliberate. Jedediah, his face set in grim lines, patched the splintered hole in the door with a piece of scrap wood. Abigail swept the last of the flour from the floorboards, the fine white dust a ghostly reminder of the chaos. The porch roof was a blackened, skeletal frame against the pale blue sky. The nearest town, Redemption, was a half-day's ride. It was a place Abigail had visited only when absolutely necessary. A place of hard-packed streets, false-fronted buildings, and even harder stairs. They rode in on Jedediah's steady roan, Dust Devil, with Abigail's mare trailing behind. They didn't speak. The threat of Silas's return hung between them, a heavy, unspoken promise. 20 men. The words were a drumbeat counting down the time they had left. As they rode down Redemption's main street, a hush fell over the town. It started at the saloon, where a man leaning against the post straightened up, his lazy appraisal turning into a sharp, focused stare. A woman shaking a rug out of a second-story window paused, her arms still, her eyes following them. Conversations on the boardwalk died in the middle of a word. They were an unwelcome curiosity, the solitary woman from the plains, whose reputation preceded her like a bad smell, and the grim, armed stranger by her side. Every gaze was a tiny weight, a judgment laid upon them. Their first stop was the lumber yard at the edge of town, a place that smelled of fresh sawdust and pine sap. The owner, a balding man named Miller with weary eyes and a perpetual frown, was sorting planks. He looked up as they approached, his eyes flicking from Jedediah to Abigail, and the professional warmth in his expression vanished. "Need lumber," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "Enough to fix a porch roof." Miller wiped his hands on his canvas apron, his gaze lingering on Abigail. "Trouble out at your place, miss?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Yet she could hear the question beneath the question. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had. "We need the lumber," Jedediah repeated, his voice unchanged, but there was a new stillness in his posture. He did not issue a threat. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable fact, his presence making it clear that this was a business transaction, not an invitation for gossip. The lumberman hesitated. Selling to her felt like taking a side, In a town like Redemption, neutrality was a form of currency, and he was reluctant to spend it. He looked at Jedediah's holstered Colt, at the hard set of his jaw, and then back at Abigail's tired, determined face. "All right," he sighed. "Finally. Planks are over here. Cost you $2. Jedediah nodded, while Miller pulled out the boards. Abigail stood by the horses, acutely aware of the man's reluctance, the way he avoided looking directly at her. It was a familiar feeling, this being treated like a contagion, a problem to be dealt with as quickly as possible. The old shame, a cold and familiar companion, began to prickle at the back of her neck. When the wood was stacked, Jedediah pulled $2 silver from his pocket and placed them firmly in Miller's hand. He didn't haggle, didn't question the price, though it was likely inflated. It was the simple, clean act of a man concluding his business fairly. Miller looked at the coins, then at Jedediah, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had perhaps expected a drifter's credit or a whispered negotiation. This quiet, respectful payment didn't fit the narrative he had in his head. Their next stop was the mercantile, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and bolts of calico. As they stepped inside, a bell above the door announced their arrival. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Gable with a face like a clenched fist and eyes as sharp and black as a crow's, stopped her chatter with another customer. The silence was immediate and profound. Mrs. Gable's eyes raked over Abigail, taking in the dust on her clothes, the weariness in her face. Then her gaze slid to Jedediah, and a look of smug, knowing condescension settled on her features. She turned to her customer, a woman in a severe black bonnet, and whispered something behind her hand. The whisper was too low to be understood, but its meaning was perfectly clear. "That's the one. The girl from the cabin. The one with the past." Abigail felt her face flush with heat. She wanted to turn and walk out, to flee the suffocating judgment of this small, airless room. But then she felt a subtle pressure at her back. Jedediah had moved to stand just behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his steadfast presence. It was a silent, powerful message. "I am here. You are not alone," drawing strength from his nearness. She walked to the counter. "Need nails?" she said, her voice a little shaky but clear. "And a sack of coffee." "Mrs.?" Gable served her with a kind of pinched, disdainful efficiency, placing the items on the counter as if they might be contaminated, as she was counting out the nails. The church bell began to toll the noon hour. The sound was a deep, resonant peal that seemed to call the whole town to account. The door opened, and the parson entered. He was a tall, thin man named Reverend Blackwood, dressed in severe black, his face pale and ascetic. He offered a general nod to the room, but his eyes settled on Abigail. "Miss Abigail," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "We were sorry not to see you at services this past Sunday." He gave her a thin, pitying smile. "The house of the Lord is a place of solace, a place where a troubled soul might find absolution." The offer was coded in the language of salvation, but the meaning beneath was one of condemnation. He was not offering comfort. He was offering a public stage for her repentance. He was suggesting, in the politest way possible, that her troubles were a result of her sins, and that only by humbling herself before the town and God could she be made clean. The Abigail of a week ago would have mumbled an apology and fled in humiliation, but as she stood there, with Jedediah, a silent bulwark at her back, something new and hard had formed in her soul. She looked up and met the parson's gaze directly. She inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My soul is at peace." Her eyes, for the first time in a long time, held no trace of shame. They were simply the clear, gray eyes of a woman who had been through a fire and had survived. The parson was taken aback. his script of gentle admonishment rendered useless. He cleared his throat and turned his attention to buying some tobacco, the moment of confrontation having passed. As Jedediah paid Mrs. Gable, a small, elderly woman who had been quietly browsing a selection of buttons, shuffled past Abigail. As she did, she pressed something small and hard into Abigail's hand. Abigail looked down to see a small spool of black thread. The woman, whose name was Martha, leaned in close, her face a web of kind wrinkles. "You pay them no mind," Martha whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "They like to put a name on people. It makes their own small lives feel bigger. Don't you let them name you, child." Before Abigail could stammer her thanks, the old woman had patted her hand and moved away, leaving behind a small, unexpected pocket of warmth in the cold atmosphere of the store. As they were about to leave, a young boy from the livery stable ran in, breathless and wide-eyed. "He's back," the boy panted, his words tumbling out. "That fella, Silas, he's over at the saloon, buying drinks for any man with a gun. Says he's going out to the old Miller cabin to collect what's his. Says he's going to have 20 men by nightfall." The news fell into the silent store like a stone into a still pond. Every eye turned to Abigail and Jedediah. The theoretical threat was now real, and it had a timeline. The town was no longer a collection of spectators. Now, they had to choose. They could be the people who stood by and watched a woman's home be destroyed, or they could be the people who stood in the way. The air crackled with the town's unspoken, collective decision. Most, Abigail could see in their averted eyes and sudden interest in the contents of a pickle barrel, were choosing to stand by. They walked out into the harsh afternoon sun, the weight of the news settling on them. They loaded the lumber and supplies, the simple, domestic task a stark contrast to the violence that was brewing. Jedediah finally broke the silence, his voice low and serious. "We can be gone in an hour. Abigail, ride west. We can find another piece of land, a place where no one knows your name or mine, a place to start over." He was offering her the one thing she had always thought she wanted: an escape, the chance to run again, to leave the whispers and the judgment and the violence behind. He was offering to run with her. She looked up at the vast, empty sky, then back at the dusty street of the town that had already judged and condemned her. She thought of Silas's sneering face, of the parson's pitying condescension, of Mrs. Gable's smug whispers, and she thought of old Martha's words, "Don't you let them name you." A profound and powerful certainty rose up in her, a feeling as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I've been running my whole life. Jedediah, I'm tired of it. This is my home. I built it with my own hands." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not running anymore." A slow smile touched Jedediah's lips. It was not a smile of happiness, but of deep, profound respect. It was the answer he had been hoping for. "All right," he said. "Then we don't run. We fight." He scanned the street, his eyes assessing the faces of the men who were pointedly looking away from them. "We can't do it alone, not against 20 men. His gaze fell on the lumber yard, on the livery stable, on the few faces that hadn't immediately turned away. "But maybe," he said, a new, determined glint in his eye, "we don't have to be alone. There have to be 1 or 2 decent men in this town. We just have to find them. We have to ask them to stand with us." The decision to not run, to stand and fight, changed the air they breathed. It was no longer the thin, sharp air of survival, but the thick, heavy atmosphere of an impending battle. They did not ride back to the cabin. To do so would be to retreat into the box, to wait for the siege to begin anew. Jedediah knew, with a strategist's cold clarity, that the fight for the cabin had to be won here, in the heart of redemption. The town had to be forced to choose. He led the horses not to the livery, but to the town's central, non-negotiable landmark, the church. It stood at the end of the main street, a simple white-painted wooden structure with a modest steeple. its yard marked by a low stone wall. It was the place where the town came to pass judgment on itself every Sunday. Today, it would serve the same purpose. A crowd had already begun to form. The news of Silas's return and his drunken recruitment drive had spread through the town like a prairie fire. People drifted out of the mercantile and the saloon, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, fear, and a grim sort of excitement. This was the most interesting thing to happen in Redemption in years. Jedediah helped Abigail down from the horse. He did not lead her to the safety of the church steps. Instead, he walked with her to the center of the dusty yard, a patch of open ground between the church door and the main street. They stopped there, two solitary figures, and turned to face the town. They were exposed, vulnerable, and utterly defiant. For a long moment, no one spoke. The town watched them, a loose, shifting circle of faces. Mrs. Gable stood on the mercantile porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour vindication. Reverend Blackwood hovered near the church door, his expression troubled, his hands steepled as if in prayer for the souls he had already condemned. A few hard-looking men, fresh from the saloon and Silas's free whiskey, jeered from the edges of the crowd. It was Abigail who broke the silence. She took a single step forward, a small movement that took a universe of courage. She did not shout, she did not plead, she spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried in the preternatural quiet, a voice stripped of everything but the hard, simple truth. "My name is Abigail," she began, her eyes sweeping across the faces before her, meeting the curious, the hostile, and the indifferent without flinching. "Many of you know me only by the stories you have heard, stories about my past." She paused, letting the weight of that word, past, settle over the crowd. "The things that happened to me years ago, in another place, are a part of my story. They are a part of my life." Her voice hitched, just for a second, but she mastered it, her spine straightening. "But my past is my own. It does not belong to you. It is not a story for you to trade over a cracker barrel or whisper about in the street. Today, I am not asking you to understand my past. I am only asking for the right to have a future. I am asking for the chance to work and to live in peace in the home that I have built." She finished, her words hanging in the still, dusty air. The silence that followed was heavy, profound. Some in the crowd looked away, their gazes dropping to the toes of their boots, a flicker of shame in their eyes. They had whispered, they had judged, and now the subject of their gossip stood before them, not as a sinner, but simply as a human being asking for the most basic of rights. The men from the saloon let out a few scornful laughs, but the sounds were hollow, lacking the conviction they had held moments before. Near the front of the crowd, a woman held the hand of her small daughter. The little girl, no older than 6, stared at Abigail, her expression not one of judgment, but of wide-eyed, solemn curiosity. She saw not a fallen woman, but simply a woman who was speaking. She tugged on her mother's skirt, but the woman did not look away, her own face a mask of conflicted emotion. Jedediah stepped forward to stand beside Abigail. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her, a silent affirmation of her courage. Then he turned his gaze to the town, his eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. His words were not a speech. They were a simple, absolute declaration of fact. "Anyone who touches her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence, "touches me." He laid a boundary, not of wood or stone, but of flesh and blood and unwavering will. He was making her fight his. He was making their fates one. The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down in the center of the town. For a moment, it seemed no one would accept it. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. This was no longer entertainment. This was a choice. Then, a man detached himself from the crowd. It was Henderson, a rancher whose land bordered Abigail's to the north. He was an older man, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. his hands thick and calloused from work. He was not a gunman or a brawler. He was a man of the land, a man who understood boundaries and respected grit. He walked across the yard and stopped, not next to Jedediah, but on the other side of Abigail. He nodded at her, a gesture of profound respect. Then he turned to Jedediah. "A porch roof. You said Henderson asked," his voice a practical, earthy baritone. "I'm no carpenter, but you can borrow my hammer and my shoulder." It was not a promise to fight. It was a promise to build. It was an offer of community, spoken in the simple language of work and mutual support, and it was more powerful than any threat. Henderson's simple act of decency broke the spell of fear and inaction that had held the town in its grip. A second man stepped forward. It was the blacksmith, a burly man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin. He grunted. "A fire on a roof is no man's right. I'll stand." Then, to everyone's surprise, Miller, the lumberman, walked out from the crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and resolve. "She paid a fair price for the lumber," he said, as if that settled the matter. "A person's got a right to what they paid for." He joined the small group, a man making up for his earlier cowardice. One by one, 3 more men joined them, creating a small, determined line in the center of the churchyard. Mrs. Gable, on the porch of the Mercantile, watched this turn of events with a stunned, tight-lipped silence. The tide of public opinion, so easily swayed by whispers and fear, was slowly, miraculously, beginning to turn. It was then that they heard it, the sound of thunder on a clear day, the rhythmic, growing roar of dozens of hooves pounding the hard-packed earth. Silas had arrived. He swept into town at the head of a posse, not of 20 men, but of nearly 30. They were a rough collection of drifters, saloon loafers, and hard cases, all drawn by the promise of free liquor and consequence-free violence. They were a mob, a tidal wave of malice, and they reined in their horses at the end of the street, facing the churchyard. Silas spurred his horse forward, a sneer twisting his bearded face. He saw the small group of townsfolk standing with Abigail and Jedediah, and he laughed, a loud, contemptuous sound. "Look at this," he roared, his voice carrying to every corner of the street, "the good, church-going folk of redemption protecting a sinner. Don't you know who you're standing with? Ask her what she is. Ask her why she had to run from every other town she's ever been in." He was using her past as a weapon, trying to shame her defenders back into the crowd, trying to reframe his attack not as a crime, but as a righteous act of public cleansing. He was trying to give his violence the blessing of moral authority. The circuit judge was 2 days away. The nearest lawman was a county away. In that moment, redemption was an island, and its people were forced to draw their own line, to define their own laws, not with ink on paper, but with their own bodies. Some of the crowd began to back away, the sight of Silas's mob and the raw, ugly truth of his words too much for them. The small line of defenders looked at each other, their newfound resolve wavering in the face of such overwhelming odds. But Abigail did not waver. The time for hiding was over. She stepped forward, out from the protective line of her new allies. She did not retreat behind Jedediah's strength. She came to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder. She was no longer a person to be defended. She was a defender. Her hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. It was a small, quiet gesture in the midst of a loud, dangerous standoff. It was a confirmation of everything they had become to each other. His hand closed around hers, a solid, unbreakable anchor. Together, they faced the mob. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, were fixed on Silas. She was looking her past, in all its ugly, violent reality, directly in the face. She would not be named by him. She would not be defined by his narrative. The fight would not be decided by the 30 guns pointed at them alone, but by the one thing everyone was afraid to speak the truth. And she was, finally, ready to tell it, with the weight of 30 guns and 100 judging eyes upon her. Abigail felt the cold knot of her old fear tighten in her stomach. It was a familiar ghost, the one that had whispered to her in the dark for 5 long years, telling her to run, to hide, to make herself small. But as she felt the solid, steady warmth of Jedediah's hand laced through hers, a different feeling rose to meet the fear. It was a quiet, unshakable strength, a feeling as solid and real as the man standing beside her. The ghost whispered, but for the first time, she did not listen. She took a breath, not a ragged gasp of terror, but a deep, calming draft of the dusty air. She looked at Silas, at his face twisted with smug, righteous anger, and she spoke. Her voice was not the voice of a victim asking for mercy. It was the voice of a woman claiming her own story. 5 years ago, she began, her words cutting through the tense silence. I was traveling with my family. We were set upon by men, not unlike you, Silas, men who believed that what they wanted, they had a right to take. She did not describe the violence. She did not need to. The simple, unadorned truth was more powerful than any lurid detail. She spoke of the aftermath, of the shame that was not hers but had been forced upon her, of the whispers that had hounded her from a town that should have protected her. I did not leave my home because of what those men did to me, she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, over the faces of the people of redemption. I left because of what the good people, the church-going people, did afterward. They looked at me, and they no longer saw me. They saw only my ruin. They named me with their pity and their judgment. She turned her eyes back to Silas, and they were as clear and hard as gray flint. So, yes, you are right. I ran until I could find a place where I could be left alone, a place where I could build a life that was my own, not one that was given a name by others. This is that place, and this is where I will stay. She did not ask for their pity or their forgiveness. She simply laid the facts of her life before them, a heavy, unvarnished truth. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A fine story. She admits it, she is what we say she is, and you, he sneered, pointing a grimy finger at Jedediah. You'd stand and die for this leftover piece of another man's pleasure. The insult, crude and vicious, was meant to shame Jedediah, to isolate him, to make him question the worth of the woman he was defending. Jedediah did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He took 1 half step forward, a subtle shift that placed him slightly in front of Abigail, and he spoke, his voice carrying with an absolute, unshakable certainty that reached every person in the street. I told you once before, he said, his eyes locked on Silas, but his words were for the entire town to hear, and I will say it again. I do not need her to be different to be worthy. The words were a thunderclap in the quiet square. He was not just defending her. He was rejecting the entire premise of their judgment. He was declaring that her value as a human being was not negotiable. It was not dependent on her past, on her purity, or on the opinions of any man in that street. It simply was. Enraged that his public shaming had failed, Silas drew his pistol. Then you can die with her, he roared. Boys, let's clean this town up. But before his men could raise their own weapons, a new line was drawn. Henderson, the old rancher, took 2 long, deliberate strides forward and stood directly in front of Jedediah and Abigail. He was not armed with a pistol, but he held the heavy hammer he had offered earlier, its worn handle gripped in his gnarled fist. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, a wall of weathered, quiet decency. The blacksmith and miller, the lumberman, moved to stand beside him, one on each side. They too were not gunslingers, but they were men who had made a choice. They formed a short, solid, unmoving line. It was a pathetic defense against 30 guns, and it was the most powerful thing anyone in Redemption had ever seen. Silas stared at them in disbelief, his face purpling with rage. "Get out of the way, you old fools!" he screamed. "This ain't your fight." "You made it our fight when you brought your trouble to our town," Henderson said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The standoff was absolute. The air was stretched thin, a single spark away from exploding into a massacre. And then, a new sound intruded. The hard, fast gallop of a single horse, coming from the east. A lone rider, a man wearing the dusty badge of a county sheriff, thundered down the street and reined his exhausted horse to a halt between the two groups. "Silas," the sheriff yelled, his hand already on his gun. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? I got a wire an hour ago about you trying to burn down a homestead last night." Silas, caught off guard, stammered, "Sheriff, this is a misunderstanding. We were just helping this town deal with an unsavory character." The sheriff's eyes were cold. "I see a mob of 30 armed men threatening unarmed citizens. I see a man who tried to set a fire to a woman's home. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime. He drew his pistol. Drop your gun. You're under arrest." The moment was broken. The moral authority Silas had tried to claim was stripped away, revealed as the thuggery it was, faced with the undeniable power of the law. The courage of his hired mob evaporated. They were not crusaders. They were drunks who had been promised a good time. Now, faced with a sheriff and a possible hanging, they began to melt away, their horses turning and trotting back toward the saloon or out of town, their riders suddenly very interested in being somewhere else. Silas, abandoned and defeated, threw his gun to the dirt in disgust. The sheriff dismounted, his cuffs glinting in the sun. The great battle for redemption had ended not with a volley of gunfire, but with the quiet, decisive click of a pair of handcuffs. The crowd began to disperse, the townsfolk shuffling away, their appetite for drama sated. But something had changed as Abigail and Jedediah stood there, their hands still clasped. A few people approached them. It was Henderson, the rancher. "That porch still needs fixing," he said, with a nod. "Sun will be down in a few hours. We'd best get to it." Miller, the lumberman, cleared his throat. "The lumber's already paid for," he said gruffly. "No sense in it sitting here." One by one, a small group of men, the same men who had formed the line, offered their help. No grand apologies were made. No one spoke of the past. They spoke of hammers and nails, and the simple, honest work of rebuilding what had been broken. The community, slowly, clumsily, was learning to be quiet about the past of others, and to speak instead in the language of a shared future. That night, they sat in the small cabin. The porch roof was a patchwork of new, pale wood against the old, weathered logs, but it was solid, and it was whole. A fire crackled in the stove, a warm, steady heartbeat in the center of the quiet room. They sat at the small table, their tin cups of coffee steaming in the soft lamplight. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. The day had been too full of big words. The silence was a comfort. "Tomorrow," Abigail said, her voice soft, "I need to plant the beans before the ground gets too hard. And we'll need to dig a better irrigation ditch from the creek," Jedediah added, "before the summer heat comes." They were not talking about love or marriage or the rest of their lives. They were talking about tomorrow. They were talking about the small, ordinary, essential tasks of building a life together. It was a promise more real and more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. Abigail reached across the table and placed her hand on his. It rested there, warm and steady. The trembling was gone. She had been tested by fire, and her fear had been burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, tempered steel. She had made her choice. A rare, small smile touched the corners of Jedediah's mouth. He looked at her, his eyes warm in the firelight. "We don't start where people want us to," he said, his voice a low murmur. "We start where we stand together." By the door, his saddle and reins hung from a wooden peg. Their journey over, outside, the wind still blew across the vast, empty plains, a lonely, ceaseless sound. But for the first time in a very long time, the little cabin did not feel lonely at all. Their love, born not in a sun-drenched meadow but in the heart of a siege, had found its home. It was a love built on the solid ground of respect, and it would be sustained, day by day, by the simple, repeated choice to stand together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to me.